We all know the vampire films of blood-sucking counts or the romanticism of the teenage undead as seen in the Twilight films. But are vampires simply a work of fiction? Or is there evidence of their existence? In this episode, we'll look at a few historical cases and ask ourselves, what are vampires? And do they really exist? Vampire accounts go back to ancient Egypt, though the term vampire came later. But it was during the Middle Ages that vampirism was at its peak, and the modern vampire, while its most famous depiction being Dracula, created by Bram Stoker and based on Vlad the Impaler, who happens to be a relation to our own royal family. Now there's a thought.
The genealogy shows that I'm descended from Vlad the Impaler, you see.
Let's look at a few true cases of vampires through history. A kind of renaissance of vampire accounts happened during the 18th century. One of the most well known of these was the case of Peter Blagojevich, and this probably gave rise to what we now know as the modern vampire. Peter Blagojevich, who in 1725 died in his home village of Kiselova. But accounts suggest that he didn't remain dead for long. 3 days after his death, Peter returned from the grave to visit his son for food. His son fed him, but the following night Peter returned demanding more food. When his son refused, Peter left. But the next morning his son was found dead. A few days went by and 9 more people from the village died mysteriously. Each victim had complained of exhaustion before they died and had lost large amounts of blood, and just to add suspicion, they had all claimed to have dreamt of being visited by Peter. An alarmed parish priest wrote to the local magistrate court, who sent a nearby commander of imperial troops and 2 officers and the local executioner to exhume the corpses. What they found shocked everyone. Peter's body was perfectly preserved and was said to have blood around his mouth. Following the discovery, a stake was thrust into Peter's chest and they burnt his body and of those of his victims. No scientific explanation has been given, and seems unlikely to be a work of fiction due to the officials involved and their accounts. William of Newburgh was a revered 12th century English historian and chronicler. His major work, Historia Rerum Anglicarum, not only chronicles the time of William the Conqueror and Richard the Lionheart, but it also tells of some of the earliest recorded tales of vampires in the UK. William of Newburgh was not known for his flights of fancy and is renowned for his historical accuracy and valued assessments, so these accounts should not be taken lightly. One of the first reports in his chronicle happened in Buckinghamshire and tells of a man who returned from the dead and assaulted his wife over several nights, and then the man's corpse then terrorised both her family and her neighbours. Only when an absolution was written by the local clergy and then placed on the corpse did the body bind itself to the grave. William wrote of many other accounts of townspeople and peasants up and down the country who had experienced the undead. William described them as revenants, a word derived from the Latin meaning of returning and the French verb revenir, to come back, and known to mean the undead. In most cases in William's chronicles, the undead vampires acted out of revenge, and when alive the revenant had been a wicked person. His accounts were similar to those found in European stories of vampires. Was William of Newburgh collecting these accounts of 12th century British vampires or similar undead creatures? Belief in souls returning from the dead were common in 12th century, and William was of a sound and critical and honest mind. In the late 19th century, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in America, and at the time there was no cure, and the symptoms included night sweats, fatigue and coughing up blood. Residents in a small town on Rhode Island called Exeter began to fear that a vampire-like creature named Mercy Brown was causing these deaths, even though she had herself died from the same disease. It all began when George Brown, a farmer, lost his wife to tuberculosis in 1884. 2 years later, his eldest daughter also succumbed to the disease. The Brown family began to lose members one by one, which began to arouse suspicion, as the Browns appeared to be a family of good health, until George's son Edwin became seriously ill. Not long after, his daughter Mercy Lena Brown also died of tuberculosis at just 19 years old. Meanwhile, Edwin's condition worsened. George was later told an old folk tale that in some unexplained way, in some part of the deceased relative's body, live flesh and blood may still be found, and which then feeds on the living who are in bad health. The old folk tale claims that when members of the same family waste away from consumption, it might be because of the undead draining the life force out of the ill but living relatives. At the time, George gave it little credence until the bodies of the family members were exhumed. They found the remains of George's wife and eldest daughter, but shockingly, the body of Mercy Brown was without any decay, and live blood was found in the heart and the liver. Was Mercy Brown some kind of vampire, as told in the accounts of these tales of old? And what happened to her brother Edwin? Well, he was given water mixed with Mercy's ashes in an attempt to save him. Unfortunately, it didn't. As for Mercy Brown, her heart and liver were removed before she was reburied. These accounts were not isolated, and many more exist all over the world and throughout history. So it seems vampires do exist and have possibly existed through history and folklore. You'll be hard-pressed to say that there isn't anything in these or other accounts, especially when viewed openly and balanced out with their connections to the ancient world and the occult. Until next time, good night.